Target acquired, Admiral. Permission to fire? The words cut through the air like a scalpel, sharp and deliberate, as Lieutenant Varric stood poised at his console. Around him, the command deck of the Zenith Dominion flagship shimmered with the cold, pulsing glow of holographic displays. The light threw ghostly patterns across the walls of polished obsidian, and the intricate armor of the crew, their expressions carved from stone. This was no ordinary vessel. It was a living fortress, a symphony of bioengineered sinew and crystalline alloys that pulsed faintly with an unnatural rhythm. Hold. Grand Admiral Cormac's reply was measured, his tone honed like the edge of a blade. He leaned forward in his command chair, a skeletal frame of living metal that adjusted subtly to his shifting posture, his eyes, cold and calculating, fixed on the central display. Before them floated the intruder, a lone ship, its design alien in its simplicity, cutting through the starlit void like a predator that had wandered into an ancient hunting ground. The HMS Vigilant. An Earthship, Cormac murmured, the words tasting foreign like ash. His gaze narrowed. They have no fleet, no allies. They've been nothing more than dust under our Dominion's boots for centuries. Yet here they are. The bridge felt alive, almost sentient, responding to the Admiral's quiet contemplation. Bioluminescent tendrils along the walls flexed in time with the ship's neural core. The air was thick with a metallic tang, a subtle reminder of the ship's fusion of organic and machine, a living weapon born from the bones of conquered worlds. "Orders, sir?" Varric asked, his mandibles twitching, betraying his impatience. "Patience, Lieutenant." Cormac's lips curled into a thin smile. "Let's see what this anomaly does." The Vigilant hung in space, motionless, its hull a patchwork of angles and dark plating that seemed to absorb the starlight around it. Its presence was defiant, almost insulting in its audacity. A faint pulse rippled through the Zenith crew, a collective unease they would never dare express. Cormac felt it too, though he would never admit it. Something about the ship's presence felt wrong, like a predator whose tactics you'd yet to understand. "Broadcast standard Dominion greeting," Cormac ordered. "Remind them who owns this sector of the galaxy." A chorus of clicks and beeps resonated as Varric initiated the communication link. Moments later, the human vessel's bridge appeared on the main display. It was dimly lit, a stark contrast to the Zenith's bioluminescent brilliance. The captain stood at the center of the screen, calm and motionless, yet radiating an almost tangible intensity. His nameplate identified him, Commander Arik Sailos. His uniform, though unadorned, carried an air of understated authority. He had the kind of face that had seen far too many battles and carried each one like an invisible scar. His dark eyes met Cormac's with a force that felt like a blow. "This is Grand Admiral Cormac of the Zenith Dominion," Cormac began, his voice a low rumble that carried both disdain and inevitability. "You have trespassed into sovereign territory. Surrender your vessel and prepare to be boarded. Resistance will not be tolerated." Sailos didn't move. For a moment, Cormac wondered if the human was frozen by fear. But then Sailos spoke, his words measured, his tone sharper than the Dominion's finest blade. "Sovereign territory?" he said, his voice tinged with dry amusement. "You mean the wreckage of free civilizations you've chained and plundered for centuries?" A murmur rippled through the Zenith bridge. Varric glanced at Cormac, awaiting his reaction. But Cormac's expression remained stoic, his gaze locked on the human. "You speak as though you have a choice, Captain," Cormac replied, his tone dripping with condescension. Sailos tilted his head slightly, studying the Admiral with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a particularly predictable experiment. Then he smiled, a small, dangerous thing that seemed to cut through the distance between them. "Choice is what brought us here," Sailos said. "Your empire doesn't scare us, Cormac." "Not anymore." Before Cormac could respond, the Vigilant moved. In a burst of light, the ship accelerated toward the Dominion fleet with a precision that seemed almost reckless. Alarms flared across the Zenith flagship as the smaller vessel disappeared from their targeting systems. "Impossible!" Varric hissed, his claws clattering over his console. Their systems shouldn't be advanced enough to— Enough excuses, Cormac barked. Find them. The bridge was a maelstrom of activity now, the tension palpable. The Vigilant reappeared on their sensors for a fraction of a second, skimming the edges of the fleet before vanishing again. Each appearance was accompanied by a flash of light as Zenith ships attempted to fire, their weapons striking nothing but empty space. "They're using a cloaking technique," Varrock said, his voice tinged with frustration. "No," Cormac said, his eyes narrowing as he watched the patterns. "They're using us, hurting us, like prey." The words left his mouth as a low vibration coursed through the flagship. A series of explosions rippled across the fleet. On the display, 3 Dominion ships faltered, their neural connections severed by precisely timed strikes. "Damage report," Cormac roared. "Multiple ships disabled," Varrock replied, his voice strained. "They're targeting the neural cores. How could they possibly know?" Cormac's fists clenched. The humans weren't just fighting. They were studying, learning. Each maneuver was deliberate, each strike calculated. This wasn't desperation. It was strategy. The Vigilant emerged from the chaos, its sleek hull unmarred, and turned to face the Zenith flagship directly. For the first time in Cormac's long career, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in decades: doubt. The human captain's face reappeared on the display, his expression calm, almost mocking. "We're just getting started," Silo said, his voice like a distant storm on the horizon. "You've spent centuries perfecting domination. Let's see how you fare against resistance." The transmission ended. The Vigilant disappeared once more into the void, leaving the Zenith fleet to regroup amid the smoldering wreckage of their fallen ships. Cormac stood slowly, his breath steady but shallow, his gaze fixed on the void where the human ship had vanished. The crew awaited his next order in silence, their confidence shaken. "Recalibrate our fleet's neural links," Cormac said finally, his voice cold and precise. "We'll adapt to their tactics. I'll remind these humans why the Dominion has ruled for 1,000 generations." But deep inside, he couldn't shake the image of the human captain, those calm, defiant eyes that seemed to know something he didn't. The HMS Vigilant drifted quietly in the void, her matte black hull absorbing the faint light of distant stars. On board, the bridge was a stark contrast to the Zenith flagship's opulent, living glow. Here, functionality reigned. A low vibration from the ship's systems rippled through the floor, an almost imperceptible thrum of life, steady as a heartbeat. Every surface bore the wear of countless battles, the polished edges long scuffed by boots and time. Commander Arixelos stood at the center, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared at the tactical display. The holographic map pulsed faintly, tracing the positions of the Zenith ships that had regrouped after their losses. His face was unreadable, the faint lines around his eyes etched by years of service. A quiet intensity radiated from him, one that demanded attention without force. "Report," he said, his voice low but firm. "Tooth and claw, sir." Lieutenant Kira Halden, the Vigilant's tactical officer, leaned forward over her console, her green eyes sharp as she analyzed the data. "They're pulling back, regrouping just outside their safe perimeter. Standard Dominion playbook. They'll recalibrate, adapt their strategy." "They always do," Arik replied, his tone clipped. "But that cost them 3 ships. Make sure we log every move. If we're going to outlast them, we need to know the shape of their instincts." "Yes, sir," Kira said, her fingers dancing over the interface. Across the bridge, the crew moved with a quiet precision, their voices murmuring updates, their faces tight with focus. Unlike the Zenith's perfect synchronization, born of neural integration, the Vigilance crew worked as individuals, a carefully tuned orchestra of instincts and expertise. The faint hiss of the tactical display deepened, signaling an incoming transmission. "Bridge, this is engineering," came the voice of Chief Engineer Lin Quan, clear and slightly raspy, like gravel smoothed by a stream. "Primary system stable, but we took some stress on the thermal exchangers during that last maneuver. I'll need an hour to reroute power and keep them from frying themselves." "You've got 30 minutes," Arik said without hesitation. Of course I do, Quan muttered dryly. The channel cut off with a faint click. Captain, said Lieutenant Adam Tarek, the ship's communications officer. His voice carried the faintest tremor, but his professionalism kept it steady. Zenith flagship is hailing again. Arek's lips tightened, his gaze sharp as a drawn blade. Let them stew. Silence is a message, too. Tarek nodded, swallowing the hint of unease that threatened to creep into his voice. Yes, sir. Arek turned his attention back to the tactical display. The Zenith's movements were deliberate, like a stalking predator circling its prey. Yet their precision, their predictability, was a flaw as much as it was a strength. It was a rhythm that could be disrupted, broken. Behind him, the bridge door hissed open, and Lieutenant Harlow Yaren stepped in, her flight suit streaked with soot and grease. She carried the weight of someone who lived with one foot in danger, her sharp features illuminated by the dim glow of the bridge. Didn't think I'd miss all the fun, did you? She said, her tone light, though her eyes betrayed the same tension coursing through the room. You're just in time for the planning session, Arek replied, allowing the faintest hint of a smile. We're writing the sequel to their humiliation. Kira looked up from her station, her voice cutting through the charged atmosphere. Sir, the flagship's patterns are shifting. They're deploying drones in a three-dimensional net. Looks like they're trying to box us in. Arek's eyes flicked to the holographic map, studying the swarm of dots forming a web around their position. They're forcing us into a choke point. Clever. Harlow snorted, brushing soot from her sleeve. Clever only counts if we play their game. Arek's mind raced. The Vigilant was smaller, faster, and more agile than any ship in the Zenith fleet, but their numbers and firepower could overwhelm even the best tactics. They had to think not just ahead, but outside the grid entirely. Kira, overlay their drone positions against the probable firing arcs of their fleet, Arek ordered. Harlow, I want you and Tarek to calculate the probability of masking our movements using debris from their wreckage. We're hiding in their mess? Tarek asked, his eyebrows lifting. We're not hiding, Arek said sharply. We're baiting. The room shifted, a subtle tension pulling the crew tighter together. There was no room for doubt in Arek's command. The bridge buzzed with concentrated energy, the hum of calculations and orders filling the air like the charge before a storm. The map shifted again, displaying the tactical overlay. The drone net shimmered, a lattice of cold, calculated efficiency. Arek's mind worked through the data, piecing together fragments of opportunity. Captain, Kira said, her voice breaking his thoughts. The debris fields can obscure their sensors for approximately 8 minutes before they recalibrate. Good, Arek said. We'll give them something to recalibrate. Harlow, prepare a diversionary run, just close enough to rattle their cage. Once their drones recalibrate, we'll thread the gap and move to their flank. Harlow grinned, a sharp, wild expression. That's why you keep me around. Among other reasons, Arek replied, his tone even. As Harlow left to prep her squadron, Kira's voice cut through the charged air again. Sir, they're closing in. We'll need to move soon. Arek took a slow breath, his fingers resting lightly on the console. He could feel the faint vibrations of the ship under his boots, the subtle promise of power and potential. Hold position, he said finally. We move when they think we've surrendered to the net. The bridge fell into a tense silence. Each crew member braced for the moment to come. The Zenith fleet moved closer, their net tightening, their confidence growing. It was a trap, but not the one they thought. Captain, Tarek said, his voice low, we've got an incoming signal from the Zenith flagship, audio only. They're taunting us. Arek allowed himself a small, humorless chuckle. Let them. The seconds stretched into an eternity as the Zenith's trap closed around them. Arek could almost feel the anticipation, the weight of their arrogance pressing against his ship. Now, he said softly. The Vigilant surged forward, a burst of motion that left the crew breathless. Kira's hands flew over her console, directing the debris into their wake, while Tarek manipulated the comms to scatter false signals. Harlow's squadron darted ahead, their ships cutting through the net like wolves through a flock. Explosions rippled across the holographic map as the Zenith drones fired blindly into the chaos. The Vigilant danced through the wreckage, its movements impossibly precise, as if it were carving a path through the very fabric of the trap. "Gap closing in 30 seconds, Kira said, her voice taut. "Steady," Arik replied, his eyes fixed on the display. The ship moved with surgical precision, slipping past the final barrier just as the Zenith fleet began to realign. On the map, their formation shimmered, adjusting too late to stop the Vigilant's escape. The bridge erupted in restrained celebration, brief smiles, relieved breaths. Arik allowed the moment, but his focus remained unbroken. "This isn't the end," he said quietly, his voice carrying over the muted celebrations. "It's the beginning." The HMS Vigilant floated in the shadow of a desolate moon, its dark hull nearly invisible against the barren rock and star-specked void. Inside, the bridge was quiet, the silence tense as the crew sifted through the aftermath of their escape. The sharp tang of heated metal lingered in the recycled air, a reminder of the ship's close brush with annihilation. Consoles glowed faintly, the light catching the exhaustion etched on every face. Yet, beneath the fatigue, there was a steely resolve. Commander Arik Salos stood at the center of the bridge, his gaze fixed on the tactical display. It showed the Zenith fleet regrouped and expanding their search grid. Their movements were precise, methodical, like a predator that had tasted blood but lost its prey. The map flickered as Lieutenant Kira Halden updated the data, her fingers deftly manipulating the controls. "They're widening their net," Kira said, her voice steady despite the weight pressing down on all of them. "Looks like they're trying to cut off our fallback routes." Arik nodded, his expression hard. "They're cornering us, but they're also exposing their coordination. Every move they make is another thread we can pull." Lieutenant Adam Tarek glanced up from his station, his brow furrowed. "Sir, they've adapted faster than expected. If we don't keep moving, they'll have us boxed in." "They're efficient, not invincible," Arik replied, his voice calm but edged with determination. "Their reliance on that neural network is both their strength and their flaw." Tarek hesitated. "You think we can exploit it?" "I don't think," Arik said, his eyes cold. "I know." The bridge door slid open, and Chief Engineer Lin Quan stepped in, a tablet tucked under one arm. His coveralls were streaked with grime, and faint scorch marks hinted at the chaos in the ship's bowels. Despite his weariness, his gaze was sharp. "Thermal exchangers are stable for now," Quan said, his voice carrying the rasp of a man used to arguing with machines. "But we're running the ship hotter than it was ever designed for. If we keep pushing like this, we're going to start losing systems. Fast." Arik met his gaze. "How long can we maintain current performance?" Quan shrugged. "Depends on how lucky you feel." "Luck isn't part of the equation," Arik said. "Just keep us running." Quan muttered something under his breath but nodded, retreating to the engineering station at the edge of the bridge. Kira glanced at Arik, her expression unreadable. "Sir," she began cautiously, "if they're using a neural network to coordinate, it must have a central node. Something big enough to process fleet-wide data in real time." Arik's eyes narrowed. "And vulnerable to disruption." Kira nodded, her gaze flicking back to the display. "If we could identify it, we might have a chance to sever their coordination." "Or cripple it entirely," Arik said. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Harlow Yaren's voice crackled over the comms from the hangar. "Bridge, this is Yaren. My team's prepped and ready. What's the next move?" Arik activated the channel. "Stand by, Harlow. We're not done planning." "Copy that," she replied, a faint smirk audible in her tone. "Just let me know when you need something blown up." Kira suppressed a smile as Arik turned back to the map. His mind churned through possibilities, each more dangerous than the last. The Zenith's strength lay in their predictability, their over-reliance on perfection. Humans, by contrast, thrived in chaos. The trick would be creating enough of it. "Kira," Arik said, his tone shifting into command. "If we want to find the neural node, we need a way to force them to reveal it, something big enough to provoke a coordinated response." Kira frowned. "A direct assault?" Arik shook his head. "Too risky. We need subtlety, a way to make them show their hand without realizing it. Quan leaned forward, his brow furrowed. You're talking about baiting a system that calculates probabilities faster than we can think. That's not subtle. It's suicide. Arik turned to him, his gaze unwavering. Not if we control the variables. A flicker of unease crossed Quan's face, but he said nothing. Kira studied the tactical display, her mind racing. Slowly, a plan began to take shape. We could stage a decoy operation, she said. Use Harlow's squadron to simulate a larger fleet. If they think we're mounting a full-scale attack, they'll have to pull resources from the neural node to respond. Arik considered this, his fingers tapping the edge of the console. It's a start. But we'll need more than decoys to make it convincing. Tarek, who had been silent, finally spoke. What about their comms? If we intercept their transmissions, we could amplify false signals, make it look like our forces are bigger than they are. Quan snorted. And how do you plan to break into their comms without them noticing? It's not like they're running an open network. Tarek's lips curved into a faint smile. Who said anything about breaking in? We just need to bounce their own signals back at them. If we time it right, their systems will interpret the echoes as additional ships. Arik's expression hardened. Do it. Kira, coordinate with Harlow. I want the decoy squadron ready to launch within the hour. Quan, keep us running no matter what it takes. Aye, sir, Quan said, though his tone was far from enthusiastic. As the crew moved to execute his orders, Arik turned back to the tactical display. The Zenith fleet glowed like a constellation of inevitability, their precision both beautiful and terrifying. He could feel the weight of the gamble they were about to take, a gamble with no guarantee of survival. The bridge lights dimmed briefly as the ship shifted power, a subtle reminder of their fragility. Arik stood motionless, his mind a storm of calculations and contingencies. In the silence, the faint hum of life support systems seemed almost accusatory, as if the ship itself was questioning his decisions. We'll need more than luck to pull this off, Kira said quietly, her voice breaking the silence. Arik glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Luck's a luxury we can't afford. All we have is us, and that has to be enough. Kira held his gaze for a moment before nodding. Understood. The tactical display flickered again, the Zenith fleet shifting into new formations. Arik studied their movements, searching for patterns, for weaknesses. Every second brought them closer to discovery, to annihilation, or victory. In the depths of the ship, Harlow's squadron prepared for launch, their laughter muted by the gravity of the mission. In engineering, Quan worked tirelessly, his hands steady despite the rising pressure. And on the bridge, Arik Salo stood like a sentinel, his resolve unshaken even as the universe seemed poised to crush them. The stage was set. The game had begun. And the stakes were nothing less than survival. The HMS Vigilant surged into the black void, the sleek contours of its hull cutting through the cosmic abyss like a blade. Every system pulsed with measured precision, the ship's inner workings a symphony of controlled chaos. On the bridge, the tension was electric, each officer's focus razor-sharp as they executed Commander Arik Silos's orders with relentless precision. Decoy squadron deployed, Lieutenant Kira Halden reported, her voice steady but taut. The tactical display bloomed with new data as Harlow Yaren's fighters fanned out in coordinated arcs, their paths creating an illusion of a larger, more formidable fleet. Hold their positions tight, Arik said, his voice low and calm, though his gaze burned with intensity. Make them believe we're coming at them from all sides. Kira's fingers flew across her console, adjusting trajectories. The false signals, amplified by Tarek's ingenious comms manipulation, rippled through the Zenith fleet's sensor grid. On the holographic map, the enemy's formation began to shift, their movements a ripple of unease. Admiral Cormac's flagship is repositioning, Tarek said, his tone laced with both satisfaction and tension. They're responding, but not the way we predicted. Arik's brow furrowed. Explain. They're splitting their forces. Tarek continued, a flicker of disbelief creeping into his voice. "It's almost like they're trying to flank us." Kira turned sharply, her expression mirroring Arik's confusion. "Flanking? That's not standard for the Zenith. They favor overwhelming force, not tactical flexibility." "Which means they've learned something new," Arik said, his jaw tightening. "Or someone's feeding them data we don't have." The bridge fell into a charged silence, the weight of those words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Arik's mind raced. If the Zenith were adapting faster than expected, the plan was already teetering on the edge of failure. "Harlow," Arik called over the comms, "adjust your squadron. Push closer to their right flank, but keep it subtle. We need to draw their flagship out." "Aye, Commander," Harlow's voice crackled back, brimming with the confidence of someone who lived for the chaos of battle. "I'll give them something to chase." Kira shot Arik a wary glance. If they're adapting, Harlow's fighters might not have enough time to regroup. "She knows the risks," Arik replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We all do." The ship's vibration deepened as power rerouted to weapon systems. Kwan's voice broke through the tension over the engineering channel. "Bridge, this is Kwan. You've got everything I can give you, but if you push the core any harder, you're going to melt her down." "Understood, Chief," Arik said. "Just keep us in the fight." In the hangar bay, Harlow Yaren's squadron streaked into open space, their sleek fighters weaving through the debris field. The cockpit of her ship was a cramped metal cocoon, the sharp tang of heated circuitry filling the air as she adjusted her flight path. "Keep it tight, squad," she ordered, her voice sharp and precise. "We're not here to win a beauty contest, just to rattle their cage." Ahead, the Zenith drones moved like a school of predatory fish, their formations eerily synchronized. Harlow's pulse quickened as she angled her fighter toward the swarm, her fingers steady on the controls. Her targeting systems beeped faintly, painting her first targets. "Engaging," she muttered, firing a controlled burst of plasma rounds. The shots ripped through the nearest drones, shattering them into fragments that glittered briefly before vanishing into the void. On the Zenith flagship, Admiral Cormac watched the display with a calculating gaze. The human fighters moved with a chaotic precision that grated against his instincts, their unpredictability a stark contrast to the Dominion's rigid coordination. "Target their lead craft," Cormac ordered, his voice like frost. "Cut the head off the Serpent." The Zenith drones responded instantly, their weapons locking onto Harlow's fighter. Warning lights flared in her cockpit as the first barrage streaked toward her. "Nice try," she muttered, jerking her controls sharply. Her fighter rolled into a tight spiral, the enemy fire skimming past her shields. "Is that all you've got?" She dove into the swarm, her ship weaving through the drones in a series of gut-wrenching maneuvers. The view outside her canopy was a blur of flashing lights and twisted metal, the chaos exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. Back on the Vigilant, Kira monitored Harlow's progress, her brow furrowed with concentration. "She's pulling them in, but the flagship's staying back. It's like they're waiting for something." "They're testing us," Arik said grimly. "They want to see how far we'll go before we break." "Then let's not give them the satisfaction," Kira replied. Arik nodded, his gaze fixed on the map. "Prepare the decoy drones. We'll launch them as soon as Harlow breaks contact." Kira's hands moved swiftly, activating the drones that would mimic the Vigilant's signature. The small, agile crafts were their ace in the hole, designed to sow confusion among the Zenith's ranks. "Harlow, disengage on my mark," Arik said over the comms. "We're about to give them something new to think about." "Copy that, Commander," Harlow replied, her voice breathless but steady. The Zenith flagship loomed in the distance, its bioluminescent hull glowing with an eerie, predatory light. Harlow's fighter skimmed past another wave of drones, her ship's systems straining under the pressure. "Mark," Arik said. Harlow pulled her fighter into a sharp ascent, breaking free of the swarm just as the Vigilant's decoy drones launched. The false signatures filled the Zenith's sensors, creating the illusion of a sudden, overwhelming force. A murmur rippled through the bridge, a mix of awe and dread. The implications were staggering. If they could destroy the node, they could turn the tide of the entire war. But the risks were equally monumental. Location? Arik asked, his tone clipped. Tarek's fingers danced across his console. The tactical map zoomed in, revealing a massive structure nestled within the gravity well of a dying star. The node was a labyrinth of spires and conduits, its surface pulsing with bioluminescent patterns. The star's light bathed it in an eerie blood-red glow. "Of course it's in the most hostile environment imaginable," Kira muttered, her voice laced with dark humor. "They don't make these easy to reach for a reason," Arik said. His gaze lingered on the display, calculating the odds. "What's the approach?" "Direct assault is suicide," Kira said. "The star's radiation alone will cook us before we even get close, not to mention their defenses." "Then we don't go in direct," Arik said, his eyes narrowing. "We slip through their defenses, use the debris field to mask our approach." Kira frowned. "And the radiation?" "Quan," Arik called, turning to the comms. "What's the status of the shielding?" Chief Engineer Lin Quan's voice crackled through the speakers, a mix of frustration and defiance. "Barely holding together, but if you're thinking about flying into a star's gravity well, you might want to double-check your life insurance. Can you reinforce it?" Arik asked, ignoring the barb. Quan sighed audibly. "I'll jury-rig something. Might not hold for long, but it'll get you in. Probably." "That's all I need," Arik said. "Get to work." "Don't say I didn't warn you," Quan muttered before cutting the channel. Kira shook her head, her expression grim. "This plan is borderline insane." "That's why it'll work," Arik replied. "They won't expect anyone to be desperate enough to try it." The bridge fell silent again, the enormity of the task settling over them like a shroud. Arik's gaze swept the room, taking in the faces of his crew. They were tired, bruised, and battered, but they were still standing, still fighting. "Prep the ship," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "We move as soon as Quan has the shielding ready." Kira hesitated. "Sir, if we fail—" "We won't," Arik said, cutting her off, "because failure isn't an option." In the hours that followed, the Vigilant buzzed with activity. Crew members moved through the narrow corridors, their boots echoing against the metal as they prepared for the mission. The air carried the faint tang of coolant from the hastily reinforced shielding, a chemical reminder of the ship's fragile state. In the hangar, Harlow Yaren inspected her fighter, her hands gliding over the battered hull. She spoke softly to her team, her words steadying as they prepared for the chaos to come. Back on the bridge, the tactical display shifted, the node's ominous silhouette looming larger as they drew closer. The star's light flickered through the viewport, casting the room in deep, shifting shadows. "Approaching the debris field," Tarak reported, his voice steady despite the tension. "Radiation levels rising, but within tolerable limits." "For now," Kira muttered. "Stay sharp," Arik said. "We only get one shot at this." The Vigilant slipped into the debris field, its movements deliberate and precise. The remains of shattered ships drifted around them, their jagged edges glowing faintly in the star's harsh light. Every creak of the hull, every flicker of the displays, felt magnified in the oppressive silence. Kira's voice broke the stillness. "We've got movement. Enemy patrols, closing fast." "Hold course," Arik said. "Let the field mask us." The seconds stretched into eternity as the Zenith ships passed dangerously close, their sleek forms glinting like predators in the dark. The Vigilant remained still, its crew holding their breath as the enemy drifted past, oblivious. "Clear," Tarak said, exhaling slowly. "Not yet," Arik replied. "We're just getting started." Ahead, the neural node loomed larger, its spires twisting like malevolent claws. Arik's jaw tightened. The mystery of what lay inside whispered to him like a distant storm. Whatever the Zenith were hiding, they had just placed it within his reach. The HMS Vigilant drifted closer to the Zenith neural node, its silhouette a ghost against the fiery glow of the dying star. The node loomed ahead, a labyrinth of pulsing conduits and spires that twisted unnaturally, their patterns hypnotic and wrong. The dying star's gravity churned the debris field around them, fragments of ancient ships and shattered metal groaning as they scraped against one another, an eerie symphony of the dead. Inside the Vigilant, the bridge buzzed with a strained intensity. The tactical display flickered with updates as Lieutenant Kira Halden coordinated the ship's final approach. The node's defense grid was an intricate web of energy fields and automated turrets, a fortress designed to annihilate anything foolish enough to come close. Every passing second brought them nearer to the point of no return. "Shields are holding," Chief Engineer Lin Quan said through the comms, though his voice carried a warning edge. "But this radiation isn't playing nice. You've got maybe 10 minutes before the systems start melting down." "That's 9 minutes more than we need," Commander Arik Silos replied, his gaze locked on the glowing structure. His tone was calm, but his body was taut, his every movement a coiled spring. "Enemy patrols shifting," Kira reported, her voice clipped. "They're realigning to cover the eastern arc. They don't see us yet." "They will," Arik said, his eyes narrowing. "They'll smell this coming the moment we break cover. Tarek, status on the decoys?" "Ready to deploy," Lieutenant Adam Tarek replied, his fingers dancing over his console. "They'll buy us time, but not much. Once we're in range, it's all us." "Understood," Arik said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Deploy the drones on my mark." The bridge lights flickered as the ship strained against the rising heat, the recycled air tinged with the faint metallic bite of overheating systems. Arik could feel the vigilance pulse in his bones, the faint vibrations a reminder of how precarious their situation was. Every creak of the hull, every flicker of a console, felt amplified in the oppressive quiet. In the hangar bay, Harlow Yaren's squadron prepared to launch. The sleek fighters gleamed under the harsh lights, their surfaces marred by scorch marks and hastily patched hulls. Harlow stood near her cockpit, her gloved hand resting lightly on the cool metal as she addressed her team. "We hit them hard, fast and loud," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Don't get fancy. Just give the Vigilant the window they need." Her team nodded, their faces grim but resolute. They knew the odds, but they also knew Harlow. If anyone could pull this off, it was her. Back on the bridge, Arik's voice cut through the comms. "Harlow, launch on my signal. Kira, bring us into position. Tarek, deploy the decoys now." A series of rapid confirmations echoed across the ship as the decoy drones launched, scattering into the debris field. Their signals flared like fireworks, drawing the attention of the node's defense grid. Turrets swiveled, their glowing barrels tracking the false targets with mechanical precision. "Decoys engaged," Tarek said, his tone tight. "They're taking the bait." "Good," Arik replied. "Harlow, you're clear." In an instant, Harlow's fighters roared out of the hangar, their engines leaving faint trails of ionized particles in their wake. They moved like a pack of wolves, weaving through the debris with a predatory grace. The node's defenses began to shift, their focus torn between the decoys and the incoming squadron. "Contact in 20 seconds, Kira announced, her fingers flying across the tactical interface. "Their turrets are locking on." "Make them work for it," Arik said. The first volley from the node's defenses streaked through the void, searing lines of energy that illuminated the battlefield in bursts of harsh light. Harlow's squadron dodged with impossible precision, their ships darting through the storm like needles threading chaos. "Fighters engaging," Harlow's voice crackled over the comms. "We're keeping them busy, but they're adapting fast." "Then we move faster," Arik replied. "Kira, bring us in." The Vigilant surged forward, its shields flaring against the rising radiation. The ship's hull groaned under the strain, the sound deep and resonant, like the exhale of a titan. Arik could feel the heat pressing in, a relentless reminder of how close they were to the star's wrath. "Enemy reinforcements inbound," Tarek called out. "2 cruisers, closing fast." "They're not here to chat," Kira muttered. "Adjust course," Arik ordered. "Keep the cruisers at bay while we focus on the node." The Vigilant's cannons roared to life, spitting bursts of plasma at the approaching cruisers. The explosions lit up the tactical display, their brilliance fleeting but violent. The cruisers returned fire, their beams slicing through the debris field with terrifying accuracy. "Shields down to 60%, Quan reported, his voice tight. "You've got to make this quick, or we're toast." "We're almost there," Arik said, his tone unshakable. "Kira, status on the node." "Defense grid is thinning, but we need another push," Kira said. Harlow's squadron is drawing fire, but they won't last much longer. Harlow, fall back, Arik said. We'll take it from here. Copy that, Harlow replied, her voice breathless but defiant. Good hunting. As the fighters retreated, the Vigilant plunged deeper into the node's defenses. The spires loomed above them now, their surfaces writhing with organic patterns that seemed almost alive. Energy coursed through the conduits, a silent heartbeat that filled the void with a dreadful rhythm. Target acquired, Kira said, her voice sharp. Firing solution locked. Do it, Arik said. The Vigilant's main cannon charged, its glow casting long shadows across the bridge. The weapon fired, a searing bolt of energy that struck the node's core with devastating force. The impact rippled through the structure, shattering conduits and silencing its rhythmic pulse. Direct hit, Kira reported, her voice trembling with triumph. The node is... Her words were cut off as the tactical display flared with new data. Lines of alien script scrolled across the screen, their meaning elusive but ominous. What the hell is that? Tarek muttered. It's a failsafe, Kira said, her face pale. The node's transmitting something. Arik's eyes narrowed. To where? Before anyone could answer, the screen shifted, revealing a new structure buried deep within the star's core. It was massive, its surface bristling with weapons and conduits that glowed with an otherworldly light. Another node, Tarek said, his voice barely above a whisper. No, it's the command hub. The realization hit like a thunderclap. The node they had destroyed was only a piece of a far larger puzzle, and they had just alerted the Zenith to their presence. Get us out of here, Arik ordered, his voice cutting through the rising panic. Now! The Vigilant turned sharply, its engines roaring as it fled the dying node. Behind them, the star flared violently, its surface churning as the hub began to awaken. We've stirred the hornet's nest, Kira said, her voice trembling. Good, Arik replied, his gaze hard. Now we know where to strike. The HMS Vigilant tore through the debris field like a hunted animal, its hull glowing faintly from the residual heat of the dying star. On the bridge, the atmosphere was electric, every crew member operating at the limits of their focus. The tactical display lit up with the signatures of Zenith ships converging, their movements like a tightening noose. Radiation levels dropping as we exit the gravity well, Lieutenant Kira Halden reported, her voice tight with exhaustion. But their cruisers are closing fast. They'll be on us in 2 minutes. Commander Arik Salos stood at the center of the chaos, his expression carved from stone. His mind raced through calculations, each decision sharper than the last. The Zenith command hub loomed in his thoughts, a massive, pulsating threat hidden in the inferno of the star. They'd struck at the node, but the retaliation had come swiftly and brutally. Tarek, Arik said, his tone clipped. Signal Harlow's squadron. I want them ready to intercept any pursuit. They're low on ammunition and running on fumes, Tarek replied, his fingers flying over his console. They can't hold them off for long. They don't need to, Arik said, his voice unwavering. We just need a window. The bridge lights flickered as the ship's systems strained, the faint tang of overheated circuits mingling with the metallic bite of tension. Chief Engineer Lin Quan's voice crackled over the comms, carrying both urgency and defiance. Salos, the Corps is not going to take much more of this, Quan barked. You've pushed her harder than she's ever gone, and she's close to breaking. Just keep her together, Quan, Arik replied, his gaze never leaving the tactical display. We're almost clear. Almost doesn't cut it, Quan muttered, the channel closing with a faint click. Kira's voice broke through the mounting tension. Enemy cruisers are accelerating. They're firing in wide arcs, trying to force us into a trap. Plot an evasive route through the remaining debris, Arik ordered. We need to stay unpredictable. Kira's hands moved swiftly, her green eyes locked on the shifting patterns of the Zenith ships. Adjusting course, now. The Vigilant banked sharply, its reinforced hull scraping against jagged fragments of ancient wreckage. Sparks danced briefly across the viewport, illuminating the crew's tense faces. Kira's calculations paid off as the Zenith shots missed by mere meters, their precision faltering in the chaotic field. Tarek, status on the command hub transmission, Arik said. Tarek's screen glowed with a flurry of alien data. It's still broadcasting. Whatever it's sending, it's big, and it's spreading across their fleet. I can't crack it, but it's like an activation signal. Activation? Kira glanced over, her brows furrowed. For what? I don't know, Tarek admitted, his voice laced with unease. But it's not good. Arek's jaw tightened. Then we need answers before they finish whatever they've started. Kira hesitated, her fingers hovering over her console. Sir, even if we manage to reach the hub, we don't have the firepower to take it out. Not with the damage we've sustained. We're not going in blind, Arek said. This isn't just about brute force. We need a strategy, a way to turn their strength against them. Kira nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. If we could disrupt the hub's connection to the fleet... Exactly, Arek said, his tone sharpening. Cut the head off the beast, and the body falls. Tarek, what's the weak point in their network? Tarek frowned, scrolling through the intercepted data. The hub's neural matrix is heavily fortified, but it relies on external conduits to interface with the fleet. If we can overload those conduits, it might destabilize the entire system. Arek's eyes narrowed. And how do we overload them? EMP charges, Kira suggested, her voice quickening. But we'd have to get close, closer than we've ever dared. That close, and their defenses will tear us apart, Tarek said, his voice edged with doubt. Not if we use the debris field to our advantage, Kira countered. We could plant the charges remotely, let the field mask our movements. And time them to detonate simultaneously, Arek added, his mind piecing the plan together. If we time it right, we can create a chain reaction that will cascade through their system. Kira nodded, her hands already moving to calculate the placement points. It's risky, but it's possible. It's the only shot we've got, Arek said. He turned to Tarek. Coordinate with Harlow. I want her squadron running interference while we deploy the charges. Quan, get those EMPs prepped. On it, Quan replied over the comms. But don't expect miracles. We don't need miracles, Arek said. Just results. The ship shuddered as a Zenith cruiser's shot grazed their shields, the energy crackling violently across the exterior. Alarms blared, and Kira's voice cut through the noise. Shields at 30%, she warned. We won't survive another direct hit. Then let's not give them the chance, Arek replied. All hands, prepare for combat deployment. This is it. The Vigilant veered sharply, its engines flaring as it accelerated toward the dying star. The Zenith cruisers followed, their weapons carving searing paths through the void. Harlow's squadron swooped in from the flank, their fighters darting like wasps to draw fire away from the Vigilant. Charges are prepped, Quan reported. Just say the word. Kira, plot the deployment course, Arek said. We're running out of time. The tactical display flickered, a grid overlay appearing as Kira marked the critical points for the EMP charges. Each placement was precise, designed to maximize the disruption to the hub's conduits. Course plotted, Kira said, her voice steady despite the pressure. Ready when you are. Execute, Arek ordered. The Vigilant moved with surgical precision, its trajectory weaving through the chaos of the battlefield. Each EMP charge launched from the ship's bay, drifting into position, like seeds planted in hostile soil. The debris field masked their movements, the fragments of destroyed ships creating a patchwork of shadows that confused the Zenith's targeting systems. Charges deployed, Kira confirmed. All points are green. Good, Arek said. Now we wait for the signal. On the tactical display, the Zenith cruisers pressed closer, their movements growing more erratic as Harlow's squadron continued their relentless assault. The hub's defenses lit up, its spires glowing with a malevolent energy as it prepared to retaliate. EMP charges armed, Quan said. Ready to detonate on your mark. Arek's gaze hardened. Mark. The charges detonated in unison, their electromagnetic pulses rippling through the conduits like a shockwave. The hub's glowing spires flickered, the patterns faltering as the system struggled to compensate. For a moment, the entire battlefield seemed to pause, the Zenith ships caught in a stuttering dance. It's working, Tarek said, his voice filled with awe. Their network is collapsing. Not fast enough, Kira said. Their cruisers are still operational. Then we finish the job, Arik said, his tone cold. Target the hub directly. All weapons, fire at will. The Vigilance cannons roared, their plasma bolts streaking toward the hub's weakened structure. Explosions rippled across its surface, tearing through the conduits and spires. The hub shuddered violently, its once ominous glow fading into darkness. On the bridge, the crew erupted into cheers, but Arik's focus remained sharp. The Zenith fleet was in disarray, their ships drifting aimlessly as the hub's control faltered. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the tactical display. "Prepare for the next move." The HMS Vigilant floated in the aftermath of chaos, its battered hull catching the dying embers of the shattered Zenith command hub. The star's light spilled across the debris-strewn battlefield, casting jagged shadows over a scene that still buzzed with uncertainty. The Zenith fleet, now fractured and adrift, resembled a predator robbed of its instincts, its ships faltering as the neural network's control dissolved. On the bridge of the Vigilant, Commander Arik Saelo stood unmoving at the center, his shadow stretching long under the glow of the tactical display. The map showed the disarray of the Zenith forces, but the victory tasted bitter. His shoulders, tight with tension, spoke of the weight still pressing down on him. Kira Halden broke the silence, her voice edged with relief and fatigue. "The hub is offline, their network's severed." "Doesn't mean they're done," Arik replied, his tone like steel tempered in fire. His gaze swept the room, fixing each crew member in place. "What's left of their fleet won't surrender quietly. If they come back together, it's over." Lieutenant Adam Tarek hesitated at his console, his fingers trembling over the controls. "Sir, I'm picking up scattered transmissions. They're different, not commands. Fragments, distress calls, warnings. It's like they don't know what to do." "Because they've lost their leash," Arik said. His voice was low, deliberate, each word carrying a weight that demanded silence. "The Zenith ruled through precision and control. Without it, they're nothing but scattered sparks." Kira looked up from her station, her eyes narrowing. "And sparks can still start fires," Arik nodded, "which is why we stamp them out before they catch." Chief Engineer Lin Quan's voice cut through the comms, still rasping with frustration. "I hope you're not planning anything heroic, Salos. The core's running on borrowed time and the hull's barely holding together. You push her any harder, and this ship's going to fall apart around us." "I know what she can take," Arik said, his tone measured, "and I know what's at stake." Quan muttered something inaudible, then sighed. "Just don't ask for miracles." On the tactical display, the shattered remnants of the Zenith cruisers began to move, their formation hesitant but coalescing. A few flickers of their previous menace remained, but their rhythm was broken. Arik studied the patterns, his jaw tightening. The Vigilant moved with surgical precision, its trajectory weaving through the chaos of the battlefield. Each EMP charge launched from the ship's bay, drifting into position, like seeds planted in hostile soil. The debris field masked their movements, the fragments of destroyed ships creating a patchwork of shadows that confused the Zenith's targeting systems. "Charges deployed," Kira confirmed. "All points are green." "Good," Arik said. "Now we wait for the signal." On the tactical display, the Zenith cruisers pressed closer, their movements growing more erratic as Harlow's squadron continued their relentless assault. The hub's defenses lit up, its spires glowing with a malevolent energy as it prepared to retaliate. "EMP charges armed," Quan said. "Ready to detonate on your mark." Arik's gaze hardened. "Mark." The charges detonated in unison, their electromagnetic pulses rippling through the conduits like a shockwave. The hub's glowing spires flickered, the patterns faltering as the system struggled to compensate. For a moment, the entire battlefield seemed to pause, the Zenith ships caught in a stuttering dance. "It's working," Tarek said, his voice filled with awe. "Their network is collapsing." "Not fast enough," Kira said. "Their cruisers are still operational." "Then we finish the job," Arik said, his tone cold. "Target the hub directly. All weapons, fire at will." The Vigilance cannons roared, their plasma bolts streaking toward the hub's weakened structure. Explosions rippled across its surface, tearing through the conduits and spires. The hub shuddered violently, its once ominous glow fading into darkness. On the bridge, the crew erupted into cheers, but Arik's focus remained sharp. The Zenith fleet was in disarray, their ships drifting aimlessly as the hub's control faltered. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the tactical display. "Prepare for the next move." The HMS Vigilant floated in the aftermath of chaos, its battered hull catching the dying embers of the shattered Zenith command hub. The star's light spilled across the debris-strewn battlefield, casting jagged shadows over a scene that still buzzed with uncertainty. The Zenith fleet, now fractured and adrift, resembled a predator robbed of its instincts, its ships faltering as the neural network's control dissolved. On the bridge of the Vigilant, Commander Arik Saelo stood unmoving at the center, his shadow stretching long under the glow of the tactical display. The map showed the disarray of the Zenith forces, but the victory tasted bitter. His shoulders, tight with tension, spoke of the weight still pressing down on him. Kira Halden broke the silence, her voice edged with relief and fatigue. "The hub is offline, their network's severed." "Doesn't mean they're done," Arik replied, his tone like steel tempered in fire. His gaze swept the room, fixing each crew member in place. "What's left of their fleet won't surrender quietly. If they come back together, it's over." Lieutenant Adam Tarek hesitated at his console, his fingers trembling over the controls. "Sir, I'm picking up scattered transmissions. They're different, not commands. Fragments, distress calls, warnings. It's like they don't know what to do." "Because they've lost their leash," Arik said. His voice was low, deliberate, each word carrying a weight that demanded silence. "The Zenith ruled through precision and control. Without it, they're nothing but scattered sparks." Kira looked up from her station, her eyes narrowing. "And sparks can still start fires," Arik nodded, "which is why we stamp them out before they catch." Chief Engineer Lin Quan's voice cut through the comms, still rasping with frustration. "I hope you're not planning anything heroic, Salos. The core's running on borrowed time and the hull's barely holding together. You push her any harder, and this ship's going to fall apart around us." "I know what she can take," Arik said, his tone measured, "and I know what's at stake." Quan muttered something inaudible, then sighed. "Just don't ask for miracles." On the tactical display, the shattered remnants of the Zenith cruisers began to move, their formation hesitant but coalescing. A few flickers of their previous menace remained, but their rhythm was broken. Arik studied the patterns, his jaw tightening. "Tarek," he said, "patch into their distress calls. I want to hear what they're saying." The comms crackled as alien voices filled the bridge. The words were fragmented, chaotic, a symphony of fear and desperation. Even without understanding the language, the message was clear. The Zenith were unraveling. "They don't know how to fight without the hub," Kira said softly. "It's like they've forgotten how to think for themselves." "That was always their flaw," Arik replied. "They built their empire on domination, on stripping individuality from everything they touched. Now, they're reaping the consequences." Tarek's console chimed, drawing his attention. "Sir, one transmission is different. It's coming from their flagship." Arik's gaze sharpened. "Put it through." The bridge fell silent as the voice of Admiral Cormac filled the room. It was strained, raw with frustration, yet it carried the same commanding weight as before. "To the human vessel," Cormac said, his words cutting through the static. "You've severed our network, disrupted our fleet, and destroyed our hub, but you've achieved nothing. You think you've weakened us, but all you've done is provoke a reckoning. We will adapt, we will rise, and you will be nothing but dust beneath our ascendancy." A murmur rippled through the crew, a mixture of unease and defiance. Arik let the silence stretch for a moment before he spoke, his voice calm but laced with an unyielding intensity. "Cormac," he said, his words like a blade slipping between armor. "You built your dominion on fear, but you don't understand what drives us. You think adaptability is a flaw. You think individuality is chaos, but that's where you've always been wrong." Cormac's laugh was harsh, the sound grating like metal grinding against itself. "Your defiance is futile. You've won a battle, not a war." Arik's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. Then you're more predictable than I thought. You still believe this is about war. It's not. This is about showing the galaxy what happens when the oppressed refuse to bow. And you're the relic of an era that's ending." The line cut abruptly, Cormac's response swallowed by silence. Arik turned to Kira. "Bring us about. Target their flagship." Kira hesitated. "Sir, the Vigilant. She's barely—" "She'll hold," Arik said, his voice brooking no argument. "We've come too far to stop now." The Vigilant pivoted sharply, its battered hull groaning under the strain. On the bridge, the tension was electric, every crew member working with a grim determination. The Zenith flagship loomed ahead, its spires glowing faintly as it attempted to re-establish control. "They're trying to realign their systems," Tarek said, his voice tense. "If they succeed—" "They won't," Arik interrupted. "Kira, lock all weapons on their core." The Vigilant's cannons roared to life, streaks of plasma lancing across the void. The Zenith flagship returned fire, its beams cutting through the darkness with deadly precision. The impacts rattled the Vigilant, sparks cascading from overhead panels, but the crew held their ground. "Shields down to 20%, Kira called out. "We can't take much more of this." "Then we make it count," Arik said, his eyes burning with resolve. "Concentrate fire. All power to the weapons." The ship shuddered violently as its main cannon charged, the energy surging through the hull in a blinding pulse. The beam struck the Zenith flagship's core, piercing through its defenses with an earth-shattering explosion. The shockwave rippled outward, tearing through the remnants of the fleet and scattering them like leaves in a storm. On the bridge of the Vigilant, the crew stared at the tactical display in stunned silence. The Zenith fleet was broken, its power extinguished in a single, decisive blow. The galaxy, for the first time in centuries, was free from their iron grip. Kira exhaled slowly, her voice trembling. "It's over." Arik's gaze lingered on the wreckage, his expression unreadable. "No," he said softly. "It's just beginning." The words hung in the air as the crew processed their victory. The Zenith Dominion had fallen, but the cost was etched into every scar on their ship, every face on their bridge. Arik turned to his crew, his voice firm but laced with a quiet pride. "We've done what they said was impossible," he said. "We've shown the galaxy that even the strongest can fall when faced with those who refuse to give up. This wasn't just a victory for us, it was a message, one the Zenith won't forget." As the Vigilant drifted through the ruins of the battle, the dying light of the star bathed the ship in a golden glow. The galaxy was watching, and humanity had proven that they weren't just survivors. They were challengers, defiant, unyielding, and the stars belonged to them now.